Will Ubuntu be dropping encrypted systems? The end is nigh. Let's go ahead and talk about the news that I started seeing a little bit over the weekend. Thanks for checking out this video by Switch to Linux. If you like this type of content, subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to see more, leave us a like and a comment down below. And right about the time I was working on finalizing the files for uploading the edited down versions of the weekly news roundup, I started seeing things around X about Ubuntu dropping Lux and ZFS and Btrfs and all sorts of other stuff. I'm like, wow, that's kind of crazy. That might make an interesting video. But as I said in that news program, I had a really busy weekend and did not get a chance to even, work on a weekend video to have it ready for Monday morning. But I wanted to go ahead and get this out. So I spent some time looking at this and researching what's going on. And I want to go ahead and talk about it and clarify some things and just kind of set the record straight about what's actually going on. Because one of the things that we see is, particularly on X, you start seeing news articles coming out and they're posting some element of truth. But when you dig into them, it's not quite as straightforward as you think. So let's go ahead and have a look at a couple of the headlines, and then we'll talk about what is actually going on here. So over here we have Ubuntu 26.10 could drop Btrfs, ZFS, Lux support from Grub. Oh no more encrypted systems, and all this specialty stuff's gone. It's just nothing but horrible, straight, plain text unencrypted. Okay. Here's a couple points, though. This has not been proposed in the roadmap. This is one Ubuntu engineer who suggested this for the reason of streamlining the amount of code that is available on the computer to run before the Linux operating system boots. And this applies to systems running the signed secure boot system. This is not every build. This is not the end of Ubuntu. This is not the end of encryption. This is a very short, narrow thing, which caused a deep amount of controversy that all of the main sources of Linux news have covered this. And ultimately, when you dig in a little bit more and understand what's going on, this is not the end of the world as it is. And of particular interest to me was the encryption, because I run a lot of encryption. I mean, you might think I don't, being as to how much I talk about Windows enforcing encryption. But the reality is I like encryption. I just don't like it when it's pushed on your disk and you don't know it's there or how to access those files. And the reality is, especially here in the van, everything that is a system holding personal files is encrypted. My streaming computer's not, because literally everything on this computer goes out to the public eventually. But ultimately, the computers that I have are all encrypted. But what I notice is that there's a couple of different ways that encryption is managed. One of my main computers is Endeavor OS. This runs an encryption where as soon as the computer turns on, it wants a decryption key. And then once the decryption key is satisfied, then it loads Grub, and then Grub loads the operating system. This is an instance where the boot partition, or the files called for boot in the bootloader, are all encrypted. Now, Linux Mint, on the other hand, takes a different approach. I turn that computer on, I am greeted with a Grub menu, I choose my operating system, and then it prompts me for a decryption password. I enter it, and then it boots into the system. What's the difference here? Well, the Linux Mint system, which follows the basic out-of-the-box experience for installation, that uses an LVM with a full disk Lux encryption in a way that the boot sector is not encrypted. That type of encryption does not change if Canonical moves forward with this new plan. But the way my Endeavor system runs would. Now, the Endeavor system is a little bit better, because if somebody steals that disk and they throw this into a computer, they see one single partition that's all encrypted. You know it's Lux encryption, but you don't know what it is. You don't know if it's a box of files. You don't know if it's a full operating system. It could be grandmother's shopping list. Who knows? It's all Lux encrypted. But if you were to steal the hard drive in the Linux Mint, you look at this and you can see the unencrypted bootloader. You can see what's in there and go, oh, this is a computer running Ubuntu. Of course, Linux Mint I think it still says Ubuntu in the Grub menu. I could be wrong about that. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. They look at it, they say, oh, okay, this is an Ubuntu or a Linux Mint or something, but we can't see anything in the operating system to know, whose it is, what it has, and things like that. That latter way, the way Linux Mint is doing it right now, does not change with what Ubuntu is proposing. So let's go ahead and look at this. And first we have to mention, this is not Ubuntu. This is not Canonical proposing it. This is one engineer having a conversation, albeit a controversial conversation. So let's walk through what the OMG Ubuntu article has to say, and then we'll also look at the Linuxiac, I think, is that how you pronounce theirs? Because they both make some interesting points that I wanted to mention. So they say Ubuntu engineers are debating. Well, one Ubuntu engineer proposed, and then a bunch of people jumped on and said, this is insane. So is this going to happen? Good chance. Probably not, or at least not in the way proposed, particularly the encryption module, because the LVM encryption is standard on all Ubuntu servers, and this would require some change in the way it's proposed, although there's even questions about that. So what they want to do is drop Btrfs, HFS plus XFS, ZFS file systems, along with Grub's JPEG and PNG image parsers ahead of Ubuntu 26.10. So Apple partition support table, LVM volume handling, all software RAID except RAID 1, and Lux encrypted boot partitions are also on the chopping block. Many of the features are said to be inherited by Debian, but never tested in Ubuntu. So the time here is crucial, Claude says, adding that by performing the changes directly after an LTS, we can keep affected users on an LTS release with support for 10 years rather than an interim. So their timing is perfect. These individual point releases are where they test a lot of the weird things that could break stuff. Because if something goes really bad, they can revert it without messing with an LTS. So their timing is fine. Now, the challenge here is that this all has to do with managing secure boot. And the question is secure boot secure? I personally turn it off. I don't particularly find it adds a whole lot more security. Sure, the OS can be signed. Okay, great. And we've also had cases where those OS keys have leaked. Oh, not great. We've had cases where something I know is good is not signed because they don't want to pucker up to microslop. Fine. So I just turn off secure boot. And if you turn off secure boot, this is a moot point anyway. But for those that think secure boot actually causes security, well, you might have a rude awakening if you're doing something somewhat slightly different from the out-of-the-box installation system. So Grub runs, here's the problem. Grub runs before Linux, so it lacks protections included in Linux, including a bug in any component Grub has, even if Ubuntu doesn't use it, could potentially be exploited. So this was a bug in Grub's JPEG parser. So JPEG parsers, of course, these are oftentimes used to have cute little boot screens. You boot your computer on, you see, that penguin doing battle with some, Windows logo or something, that's done in there by using the JPEG parser. But that actually has introduced some form of vulnerability. Somebody gets a malicious JPEG in there, and guess what? Your system could be compromised. And so the idea here is that they want to have a version of Ubuntu that when you use secure boot in a signed setting can have absolutely nothing but the basic needed to boot. And what they're defining that as is a unencrypted ext4. And that is it, effectively what it boils down to. So here's where it mentions here the out-of-the-box options present in here will still continue to work with full disk encryption. This is the way Linux Mint does it. You have a separate boot partition that is unencrypted, and I still have full disk encryption. If I had secure boot turned on that system and this upgrade goes through, it would not change a thing. So for people getting all riled up, that will not change a thing. Okay. Now, Canonical engineer Matej Kukri, I apologize if I pronounce these names incorrectly, has clarified that stating that the distro is not removing any kind of full disk encryption support. Of course, unless you're doing something different. If you're doing it exactly the way Ubuntu wants you to, it's not changing anything. If you manually created a LUKS encrypted boot, placed it on ZFS or Btrfs system, and configured a non-RAID 1 software, then you would not be able to upgrade to Ubuntu 26.10. You'd be locked in on the 2604 LTS. Thomas Ward points out that LVM by default is set up on Ubuntu servers, and so this would completely break Ubuntu servers. So he warns about that type of thing, and that LUKS encryption requires LVM by default in Ubuntu. So it boils down to the fact that what they want is to have an unencrypted boot with absolute minimal stuff for a person that wants to run secure boot. And for people who do not care if they run secure boot, you can still have the old way of doing it whatever you want. So is this a bunch of anger over nothing? Possibly. Obviously, any argument can be made for a slippery slope. Well, they do that, then they stop supporting the other one, and then everyone's forced into this exact way. I can understand where you're coming from, so I can understand a little bit of concern. But first, to say this is canonical doing this is not true. This is one developer who has proposed it. To say that it will completely break LUKS encryption is not true. That only breaks LUKS encryption outside of the Grub bootloader. And so this ultimately is, that's kind of what they're going for. Allegedly security, if you believe that secure boot is secure. I'm not convinced. All right, so here's canonical plans for controversial Grub. Of course, obviously, we just talked about how that is not correct. So the title here is a streamlining secure boot for 2610. And we actually have this up over here. We'll walk through the whole thing there rather than the screenshots here. That's why we haven't done it yet. Effectively, this paragraph here, they mention this only applies to systems with secure boot turned on. And it obviously raised some specific concerns in there. And then they mentioned down here the issue with the JPEGs and the PNGs and the bootloaders to give yourself pretty bootloaders. So at this stage, it's still a proposal for Ubuntu 26.10. No final implementation or details or decisions have been announced, given the scope of the proposed change and the community response. They are going to probably be in discussion. So let's have a look at the actual post itself from Juliank. I'm going to say that. Apologize again if I don't have that correct. So they're talking here about Ubuntu systems support secure boot using Grub, but that contains a lot of parsers for file systems, which create a constant source of security issues. And so that's what the concern is here, is that there's all of these different things in here. And let's just get rid of everything that we're directly not supporting is effectively what they say. They're going to retain ext4, FAT, and ISO 9660, and of course squash FS for snaps, because they cannot possibly exclude their snaps. That would be ridiculous, especially since snaps is required if you want to use that TPM means of decrypting your full disk encryption. Interesting. So maybe this is their sneaky and sly way of making sure everyone has that TPM module enabled for snap and support. I don't know. I'm not going to go down that tinfoil hat, but it is an interesting one to consider. All right, so they're removing the image formats, JPEG and PNG. They're not retaining anything, and they basically just don't want to do it because there's a security risk in all of these images inside the group, the bootloader. And then in the partition tables, they're removing the Apple partitions, and they're retaining GPT and MSOD. And of course, in addition to the simpler changes, we'll remove support for boot on complex partitions such as LVM, MD RAID, except RAID 1, and LUKS encrypted boot. Again, only if you are decrypting the boot partition as part of the full disk encryption. If the boot partition is not part of the encrypted drive, there will not be a change, just to once again clarify for the TikTok generation. All right, so as the encryption, in particular, encryption of boot only provided security by obscurity, but not actual security. That's actually where I disagree, because again, if you take my Endeavor disk and you throw it into a computer, you don't know if it's a box of files or if it's an actual operating system. If you do the same to my Linux Mint computer, you know it's an operating system. You just may not know exactly what it is. All right. And so I do disagree with that particular statement there. You want to ensure the integrity of the pieces. Our TPM full disk encryption solution correctly implements integrity in the early boot stage, and they're committed. So no, it will not remove full disk encryption. Of course, whether you're using the TPM module, which does require Snap support right now, by the way, or if you're doing it the way Linux Mint has been doing it, to my understanding. And if I'm wrong, let me know. With actual facts, not, you must be wrong because Ubuntu is evil and of the devil and supported by evil people. I don't want to listen to those arguments. I want facts. All right. As best as I can tell, as long as you set up your full disk encryption the way Ubuntu says, we are setting up a separate unencrypted boot partition and then full disk encryption, it still works. That's my understanding. So keep in mind, these changes only affect the boot, the boot partition, the file system partition tables. Lux LVM RAID solutions continue working in the booted system. They're not removing those from the Linux kernel, obviously. And so they say these are controversial options. However, we believe they'd substantially improve security. Now, this, I think, boils down to what exactly does Canonical directly manage? Because some of the first things is like Btrfs. This is a read-only file system driver that is actively supported by upstream developers. And it's required if you want to do boot to snapshot setups with Btrfs support. This is a huge positive to keep Btrfs as far as the system snapshot compression that it does. Works really well. And since it is read-only and actively developed, there's not really a good argument to take it out. They mentioned something else about software. This says RAID software 1 is incredibly common. Of course, they did address that RAID software 1 would remain. It's other RAID setups that would not. And then there's a lot of other discussion. Ultimately, T-Word here, he has some of the better arguments for the Lux encryption. We're not going to go through all of this here, just to indicate that there are a lot of good arguments here, but ultimately I think that the biggest argument here is if you're going to retain anything, it's the LVM and Lux inside of Grub, because that is something that is used as an industry standard. And so there is a lot of discussion about this. There's a lot of debate, but I know many of you have been seeing the headlines and thinking that they're completely removing all of this. Ubuntu is now completely insecure, and that's simply not true. So I want to do a video here clarifying what is going on in lieu of all of the headlines. So let me know your thoughts about all this in the comments down below. Of course, let me know, do you use Ubuntu or not? I know I personally don't use Ubuntu any longer. It doesn't have to do with this. It's just too many weird little things down the road. Just not a fan of it much anymore. But hey, I'd rather you use Ubuntu than Windows. Definitely a better option than that. So let me know again your thoughts down below. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.